The Habsburgs. Their name conjures images of unimaginable power, vast empires and centuries of rule. They were royalty draped in silks and jewels, commanding armies, marrying into the most powerful families in Europe. But beneath the glittering crowns and grand palaces, personal heartbreak stalked them. For every triumph there was often a tragedy, a devastating blow that left scars not just on their souls, but on the very path of history. These are the intimate, often raw stories of the moments that shattered their lives and forever altered the course of their magnificent and sometimes cursed dynasty. Number 2. The Emperor who buried his entire world. Franz Joseph I was a man defined by duty, a monarch who ruled for nearly 68 years. A reign longer than almost any other in European history. He ascended to the throne in 1848, a time of revolution and upheaval across the continent. He was just 18 years old, thrust into a role that demanded immense sacrifice and stoicism. His youth was cut short by the weight of the crown, and the promise of a long, prosperous reign slowly transformed into an endless procession of loss. It seemed as though fate had singled him out, determined to strip away every person he held dear one by one until he stood utterly alone, a symbol of a bygone era. His first major personal tragedy struck early, far from the polished halls of Vienna. His younger brother, Ferdinand Maximilian, often known simply as Maximilian, was a dreamer, an intellectual, and perhaps a little too naive for the cutthroat world of 19th century politics. Franz Joseph loved his brother, despite their differing personalities. In the 1860s, Napoleon III of France, with promises of glory and the backing of Mexican conservatives, convinced Maximilian to accept the crown of Mexico. It was a risky venture, a faraway throne in a land fraught with civil war and political instability. Franz Joseph had his reservations, but Maximilian, lured by the romantic notion of building a new empire, sailed across the Atlantic with his ambitious wife, Charlotte. The Mexican adventure was doomed from the start. Support from France dwindled, American pressure mounted, and the Mexican Republican forces, led by Benito Juarez, gained strength. Maximilian found himself isolated, abandoned by his foreign allies, and facing an inevitable defeat. News reached Vienna in fragments, each dispatch more grim than the last. Franz Joseph was powerless to intervene directly, his own empire facing internal pressures and military setbacks like the disastrous defeat by Prussia in 1866. The weight of his own responsibilities pressed heavily upon him. Then came the devastating news. Maximilian had been captured, court-martialed, and executed by firing squad on June 19, 1867. He met his end with dignity, refusing a blindfold, declaring, "I forgive everyone, and I ask everyone to forgive me. May my blood, which is about to be shed, flow for the good of the country. Long live Mexico." The brother he had grown up with, a romantic dreamer, was gone, brutally killed in a foreign land. The execution of a European monarch, even one who had accepted a controversial throne, sent shockwaves through the royal houses of Europe. For Franz Joseph, it was not just a political scandal. It was a deep personal wound. He felt a profound sense of responsibility, of having failed to protect his younger sibling. He ordered a grand funeral in Vienna, ensuring his brother received the full honors of a Habsburg archduke. The loss solidified a certain grim fatalism in Franz Joseph, a growing understanding that even emperors were not immune to the cruel whims of destiny. The world, he learned, was a dangerous place, and even family could not be shielded from its harshest realities. He became even more reserved, his face etched with a deeper melancholy. Years later, another shadow fell upon the family, one far closer to his heart and home. His only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was the heir to the sprawling Habsburg Empire. Rudolf was a complex figure, intelligent and liberal, but also restless, deeply unhappy, and haunted by his own demons. He clashed frequently with his conservative father, their relationship strained by differing political views. and Rudolf's increasingly erratic behavior. Rudolf's marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium was unhappy, and he sought solace in numerous affairs. He dabbled in journalism, expressing views that were often at odds with the imperial court. He harbored a deep fascination with death, collecting macabre objects and expressing a desire to end his own life. On January 30th, 1889, the news that emerged from the Imperial Hunting Lodge at Mayerling was initially vague, then horrific. The official story was that Rudolf had died of a heart attack. Soon, however, the truth began to leak out, whispered in horrified tones across Vienna and beyond. Rudolf had died by suicide in a pact with his young mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzera. He had shot her then himself. The scandal was immense, a shock that reverberated across Europe. A crown prince, the hope for the future of the dynasty, had ended his life in such a sordid and despairing manner. Franz Joseph was devastated. The loss of his only son, the male heir, was a catastrophe for the dynasty. But beyond the political implications, it was a father's grief, profound and inconsolable. The official narrative was carefully constructed to protect the reputation of the imperial house, but the reality was a raw, agonizing blow to Franz Joseph. He felt the weight of his son's despair, the failure to connect with him, to understand his inner turmoil. The Mayerling tragedy became a haunting specter in the emperor's life, a constant reminder of the fragility of even the most powerful families. He never truly recovered from this loss. He would often visit Rudolf's grave in the Capuchin crypt, standing silently lost in thought. The incident cemented his image as a stoic, sorrow-laden figure, burdened by the weight of his personal and imperial responsibilities. The succession was thrown into disarray, eventually falling to his nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination would later spark the First World War. Just 9 years after Rudolf's death, another unthinkable tragedy struck, perhaps the cruelest of all, for Franz Joseph. His wife, Empress Elisabeth, known to the world as Sisi, was a free spirit. Beautiful, but deeply unconventional. Their marriage had been difficult from the start. Sisi detested the rigid court life of Vienna and sought escape through travel, poetry, and an obsessive pursuit of beauty and health. She and Franz Joseph lived largely separate lives, though a deep, if complicated, affection remained between them. Sisi, too, was scarred by the death of her son Rudolf, a bond she had shared with him through their mutual unconventionality. She became even more reclusive, dressed almost perpetually in black, her restlessness growing. On September 10, 1898, Sisi was walking along the shore of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, accompanied only by a lady-in-waiting, when she was attacked by an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini. He plunged a sharpened stiletto into her chest. Sisi initially thought she had merely been punched, but as she boarded a steamer, she collapsed. The stiletto had pierced her heart. She died shortly after. The news was unfathomable. The Empress, a legendary beauty, a symbol of the monarchy, brutally assassinated by a fanatic. Franz Joseph was informed by telegram. His reaction was one of utter disbelief and profound despair. "You cannot know how much I loved this woman," he reportedly said, his voice broken. He was completely shattered. Elisabeth's death was the ultimate personal blow, depriving him of the last significant emotional connection he had in his immediate family. The woman who had been his companion, however distant, for over 40 years, was gone. He retreated further into his solitary routine, finding solace only in the endless work of the empire. He wore a simple black suit for the rest of his life, a perpetual symbol of his mourning. The assassination of his wife confirmed a pattern of relentless loss that seemed to define his long reign. It was as if the crown he wore was cursed, extracting a terrible price in personal happiness and family intactness. By the early 20th century, Franz Joseph was a living relic, a monarch from an earlier age, surrounded by the ghosts of his loved ones, his brother, his only son, his beloved wife, all taken from him by violent ends or self-inflicted wounds. He lived to witness the assassination of his nephew and heir presumptive, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo in 1914. The event that finally plunged Europe into the Great War. This final, cataclysmic event, though not a direct personal tragedy in the same vein as the others, represented the culmination of the forces that had been chipping away at his world. The empire he had sworn to protect, the stability he had so diligently tried to maintain, was now consumed by a global conflict that would ultimately lead to its collapse. Franz Joseph died in 1916 in the midst of the war. He left behind an empire in chaos and a personal history marked by an almost unbelievable succession of sorrows. His life was a testament to the idea that immense power does not shield one from immense pain. He was the emperor who buried his entire world, a lone, stoic figure whose personal griefs mirrored the decline of the grand dynasty he led. Number 3, the empress who couldn't be happy. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, known to the world as Sisi, was perhaps the most captivating and enigmatic figure of the Habsburg dynasty. Her beauty was legendary, her spirit wild and untamed, utterly unsuited for the gilded cage of imperial court life. Born a Bavarian duchess in 1837, she was a free-spirited girl who loved nature, riding, and poetry. She was married at the tender age of 16 to her cousin, Emperor Franz Joseph I, a man whose stern adherence to duty contrasted sharply with her yearning for freedom. This marriage, intended to secure the future of the Habsburg Empire, instead set the stage for a life marked by profound unhappiness and a series of personal tragedies that shaped her eccentric personality. From the moment she stepped into the Hofburg Palace, Sisi felt suffocated. The rigid Spanish court etiquettes, the constant scrutiny, and the controlling presence of her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, crushed her lively spirit. She was expected to produce an heir, to conform to the role of empress, to be a figurehead for a vast empire. But Sisi craved authenticity, beauty, and independence. This fundamental clash between her inner self and her public role was the underlying tragedy of her existence. Her first major personal sorrow came quickly, just 2 years into her marriage. Sisi gave birth to her first child, Archduchess Sophie, in 1855. She longed to raise her daughter herself, to shower her with the affection she felt she had been denied. However, Archduchess Sophie, ever the traditionalist, insisted on taking charge of the children's upbringing, deeming Sisi too young and inexperienced. This maternal separation was a source of deep pain for Sisi. In 1857, while on a trip to Hungary, a place Sisi adored for its wildness and relative freedom, both her daughters Sophie and Gisela fell ill. Gisela recovered, but little Sophie, just 2 years old, succumbed to a fever. The death of her firstborn child was a devastating blow for Sisi. She was consumed by grief and guilt. Her daughter, the child she had barely been allowed to nurture, was gone. Historians recount that Sisi became profoundly depressed after Sophie's death, withdrawing from court life and finding solace only in her poetry and her relentless pursuit of physical perfection. This tragedy deepened her already fragile mental state, making her even more averse to the duties of motherhood and empress. She became increasingly detached from her remaining children, Gisela and later Rudolf, fearing another loss, or perhaps unable to fully engage after the initial heartbreak. The loss of Sophie solidified Sisi's image of herself as a melancholic figure, perpetually searching for something she could not quite define or attain. Her relationship with her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was complex. They shared a liberal outlook and a certain rebellious spirit, creating a bond that was often absent in her interactions with her other children or her husband. Rudolf understood her sensitivity and her disdain for convention. However, his own life was spiraling. He was intelligent but unstable, prone to fits of melancholy and reckless behavior. He chafed under his father's conservative rule and sought escape in various pursuits, including numerous affairs. Sisi watched with a mixture of concern and resignation as her son struggled with his inner demons and his predetermined role. The news that came from Mayerling on January 30th, 1889, shattered Sisi's world. Her beloved son Rudolf was dead. The official story of a heart attack was quickly superseded by the horrific truth. Rudolf had died by suicide in a pact with his young mistress, Mary Vetsera. He had shot her, then himself. For Sisi, this was an unimaginable catastrophe. Her son, her intellectual companion, the heir to the throne, had chosen to end his life in such a desperate and scandalous manner. Sisi was utterly inconsolable. From that day forward, she rarely wore colors, almost exclusively donning black, and she had her portraits retouched to show a more sorrowful expression. Her famous beauty became a mask for her inner torment. Rudolf's death confirmed her deepest fears about the curse of her family and the futility of human existence. She felt the weight of his unhappiness, perhaps seeing echoes of her own struggles in his despair. She began to travel even more relentlessly, seeking to outrun her grief, her inner demons, and the suffocating reality of her life. She became a solitary figure, moving from one grand villa to another, always restless, always searching. The loss of Rudolf stripped away any remaining illusions of happiness or purpose she might have held within the imperial role. It confirmed her belief that her life was destined for tragedy, and that true peace could only be found in escape, even in death. Sisi's eccentricities grew after Mayerling. She developed an obsession with her appearance, spending hours on her elaborate hair, undertaking rigorous exercise regimes, and maintaining a strict diet. She cultivated her inner world through poetry, often expressing her feelings of confinement and longing for death. She became a haunting presence, a ghost of her former vibrant self, wandering through the palaces of Europe, often unrecognized or deliberately avoiding recognition. She was increasingly fragile, her nerves frayed, her spirit weary. This restless, tragic journey culminated in her own violent end. On September 10, 1898, while walking along the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, Sisi was assassinated by an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini. He plunged a sharpened stiletto into her heart. She was killed instantly, though she did not immediately realize the severity of her wound. Her death, sudden and brutal, was perhaps the only escape she truly found from a life of constant sorrow and the relentless pursuit of unhappiness that seemed perpetually beyond her grasp. Empress Elisabeth's life was a testament to the crushing weight of royal duty and the profound impact of personal loss, from the death of her first daughter to the suicide of her only son. And finally, her own violent end. Sisi's story is a tragic narrative of a beautiful, intelligent woman who could not find peace. Her personal tragedies did not shape her rule in a direct political sense, as she largely eschewed political involvement. Instead, they shaped her very being, transforming her into an icon of melancholic beauty and a symbol of the ultimate personal cost of being a Habsburg empress. Her story served as a poignant reminder that even the most privileged lives could be utterly consumed by sorrow. Number 4. The Unraveling of the Crown Prince. Archduke Rudolf was born into an intoxicating world of privilege and expectation. The only son of Emperor Franz Joseph, the first, and Empress Elisabeth. As the sole male heir to the vast Habsburg Empire, his future seemed assured, draped in the promise of power and influence. However, Rudolf was a complex, intelligent, and deeply troubled young man, burdened by the weight of dynastic duty and increasingly at odds with his conservative father and the rigid court life. His personal struggles, fueled by a series of disappointments and a pervasive sense of isolation, culminated in a shocking tragedy that shook the foundations of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and sent ripples of grief and scandal across Europe. From an early age, Rudolf displayed a sharp intellect and a keen interest in natural science and politics. He was tutored by progressive minds, which fostered a liberal worldview that often clashed with the traditionalist ethos of his father's court. He longed for meaningful work, for a role beyond ceremonial duties, but his attempts to influence policy were often rebuffed. This professional frustration contributed to a growing sense of disillusionment. His personal life was equally unhappy. His arranged marriage in 1881 to Princess Stephanie of Belgium was devoid of affection and quickly deteriorated. The couple had one daughter, Elizabeth Marie, But their relationship was strained, marked by mutual indifference and Rudolf's increasingly frequent escapades. Rudolf sought solace in alcohol, women, and a fascination with death and the macabre. He wrote articles under pseudonyms, expressing liberal views that were considered scandalous by the court. He formed friendships with intellectuals and journalists. Finding an escape from the suffocating atmosphere of the Habsburg, he was deeply unhappy, plagued by melancholy and a growing sense of despair. He often spoke of suicide, expressing a fatalistic view of life and the future of the empire. His health was also failing, possibly due to a venereal disease contracted years earlier, which caused him chronic pain and depression. The tragedy that would define Rudolf's life and legacy unfolded at the Imperial Hunting Lodge of Mayerling. It was January 1889. Rudolf had been involved in a passionate affair with Baroness Mary Wetzera, a young noblewoman nearly 17 years his junior. Mary was infatuated with the Crown Prince, drawn into his dark romantic world. Their relationship was clandestine and dangerous, and it brought Rudolf a fleeting sense of escape from his miserable existence. However, Rudolf's despair was reaching a peak. He had attempted to secure an annulment of his marriage from the Pope, but was refused. His health was worsening, and he felt increasingly trapped by his life and his responsibilities. He harbored a morbid fascination with the idea of a suicide pact, something he had reportedly discussed with other women before Mary. On the night of January 29, 1889, Rudolf and Mary traveled to Mayerling. What exactly transpired in the hours leading up to their deaths remains shrouded in some mystery, deliberately obscured by the imperial family to protect their reputation. What is known is that in the early hours of January 30th, Rudolf shot Mary Wetzera, killing her instantly. Then he shot himself. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of desperate damage control. Servants at Mayerling discovered the bodies. Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elisabeth were informed first with vague messages about a heart attack, then with the horrifying truth. The imperial family, desperate to avoid the scandal of a suicide, especially one involving a mistress, concocted a cover story. Rudolf had died of a heart attack, they declared, or perhaps a stroke. Mary Wetzera's body was spirited away from Mayerling and buried quickly and secretly. Doctors were pressured to sign false death certificates. The court went to extraordinary lengths to suppress the truth, but whispers quickly turned into rumors, then into widespread knowledge. The revelation of Rudolf's suicide and the surrounding cover-up sent shockwaves throughout Europe. The Crown Prince, the heir to one of the continent's most powerful empires, had taken his own life in a suicide pact with his mistress. The scandal was immense, damaging the prestige and moral authority of the Habsburg dynasty. For Emperor Franz Joseph, the death of his only son was a crushing personal blow, deepening his already profound sense of isolation and sorrow. For Empress Elisabeth, it was an unbearable tragedy that haunted her for the rest of her life, solidifying her own melancholic withdrawal from the world. The long-term impact of Rudolf's tragedy on the Habsburg monarchy. With Rudolf gone, the line of succession was thrown into disarray. The next in line was Franz Joseph's younger brother, Archduke Karl Ludwig, who quickly renounced his rights in favor of his eldest son, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This shift in succession would have monumental consequences decades later. Franz Ferdinand was a more conservative, less popular figure than Rudolf, and his own assassination in Sarajevo in 1914 would be the spark that ignited World War I, ultimately leading to the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. Rudolf's death also contributed to the growing sense of decline and fatalism that pervaded the late Habsburg Empire. It suggested an internal rot, a deep unhappiness within the very heart of the ruling family, mirroring the increasing instability of the multinational empire itself. His personal tragedy, born from intellectual frustration, emotional despair, and a troubled spirit, became a symbol of the empire's twilight years. The Mayerling incident transformed Rudolf from a promising, albeit troubled heir into a tragic legend, forever entwined with the dark, romanticized end of an era. The image of the Crown Prince, trapped by his destiny. Choosing a dramatic and scandalous exit continues to captivate and puzzle historians and enthusiasts alike. His unraveling was not merely a private affair. It was a public spectacle of despair that foreshadowed the eventual decline of the vast imperial structure he was born to inherit. Number 5. The Emperor's Endless Grief. Joseph II was a monarch defined by his relentless pursuit of reform, a man driven by enlightenment, ideals determined to modernize his vast Habsburg domains. He was the eldest son of the formidable Maria Theresa, and, upon her death in 1780, he finally gained full control of the empire. Yet beneath his reputation as a revolutionary emperor and a strict, often unpopular reformer, lay a heart profoundly marked by personal sorrow. His life, particularly his early years, was shaped by a series of devastating losses that left him emotionally isolated and perhaps fueled his obsessive drive for radical change. Joseph's early life was overshadowed by his strong-willed mother, Maria Theresa, who, despite her genuine affection for him, often disagreed with his progressive intention. Joseph longed for a companion who understood him, someone with whom he could share his intellectual passions and his deep sense of duty. He found this solace in his first wife, Isabella of Parma. Isabella was a beautiful and intelligent princess, but she was also melancholic and deeply sensitive, qualities that resonated with Joseph's own introspective nature. They married in 1760. Joseph was immediately captivated by her. He showered her with affection, expressing his love in tender, often poetic letters. Isabella, however, seemed to carry a burden of sadness within her. She confessed her own feelings of inadequacy and a premonition of an early death. Despite her melancholic temperament, she and Joseph formed a deep and loving bond. Intellectual and emotional, they shared a passion for music, philosophy, and a quiet intimacy that was rare in royal marriages of the time. Joseph, known for his reserved demeanor, was utterly devoted to her. He was captivated by her intellect, her charm, and her delicate beauty. Accounts from the time describe him as being completely smitten, something uncommon for a royal heir expected to simply fulfill dynastic duty. Their happiness, however, was tragically short. In March 1762, Isabella gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Maria Theresa, named after her formidable grandmother. Joseph adored his little girl, finding immense joy in fatherhood, but Isabella's health, always delicate, was precarious. After the birth of their second child, a stillborn daughter, in November 1763, Isabella contracted smallpox. The disease, a terrifying scourge of the 18th century, was swift and merciless. Joseph was by her side, desperately hoping for her recovery, but his hopes were shattered. Isabella died on November 27, 1763. At the tragically young age of 21, Joseph was utterly devastated. The loss of his beloved wife plunged him into a profound and enduring grief. He had lost not just a consort, but his confidant, his intellectual partner, the one person who truly understood him. His private letters from this period are filled with raw sorrow, expressing his despair and his inability to cope with her absence. He visited her grave frequently, often spending hours in silent vigil. His contemporaries observed a marked change in him after Isabella's death. He became even more serious, more driven, and more emotionally withdrawn. The warmth and tenderness he had shown towards Isabella seemed to vanish, replaced by a steely determination. The tragedy was compounded by another devastating loss. Just 2 years later, his beloved daughter, little Maria Theresa, his only surviving child, also contracted smallpox. She died in January 1767, at the age of 5. This second blow, the loss of his daughter and only heir, shattered any remaining personal happiness Joseph might have clung to. He was left with no immediate family, no wife, no child. Accounts describe him as being utterly broken, the emperor in waiting, haunted by the ghosts of his lost loved ones. Under pressure to secure the succession, Joseph entered into a second marriage in 1765 with Maria Josepha of Bavaria. This union was purely a matter of dynastic duty. There was no affection, no warmth between them. Joseph treated her with cold indifference, and Maria Josepha herself was reportedly unhappy, and died of smallpox just 2 years later, without having produced an heir. Her death, unlike Isabella's, brought Joseph no personal grief, only a grim confirmation of his lonely destiny. The impact of these tragedies on Joseph II was profound and far-reaching. The loss of Isabella and his daughter transformed him. He became even more intensely focused on his duties as ruler, pouring all his energy into governing and reforming his empire. His personal life became almost non-existent, his emotional defenses impenetrable. Some historians suggest that his relentless, sometimes rigid pursuit of reform was a way of coping with his profound personal grief and loneliness. He became known as the Revolutionary Emperor, precisely because he applied an almost clinical, impersonal logic to his reforms, driven by a desire for efficiency and rationality, perhaps lacking the empathy that emotional connections might have fostered. His personal losses hardened him, turning him into a stoic-driven monarch who placed the welfare of the state above all else, including his own happiness. He dedicated his life entirely to his work, often working from early morning until late at night, immersing himself in state affairs. He never remarried after Maria Josepha's death. He had no more children. He faced his reforms, often unpopular and difficult, with an unwavering resolve that perhaps stemmed from having already endured the deepest personal pain. Joseph II died in 1790, his health broken by years of relentless work, and his spirit perhaps still carrying the burden of his early sorrows. His reign, though ultimately seen as progressive, was cut short, and many of his reforms were reversed after his death. But his personal story stands as a testament to how deeply tragedy can shape a ruler, turning a sensitive young man into a solitary, driven emperor, forever marked by the ghosts of his beloved wife and daughter. His endless grief became a silent companion throughout his reign, shaping the very nature of his rule. Number 6. The Widow Empress and a Lasting Shadow. Maria Theresa was an unlikely empress. When her father, Charles VI, died in 1740, she ascended to the Habsburg throne, a decree designed to ensure her succession. However, many European powers challenged her right to rule, plunging the empire into the War of the Austrian Succession. Maria Theresa, then just 23 years old, displayed astonishing resilience, intelligence, and political acumen, successfully defending her inheritance and proving herself a formidable monarch. She would go on to reign for 40 years, becoming one of Europe's most influential and beloved rulers, a devoted mother to 16 children and a tireless reformer. Yet, despite her formidable public persona, Maria Theresa was also a woman who experienced profound personal happiness, followed by an equally profound and lasting grief. Her heart belonged to one man, her husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine. Their love story was unusual for the 18th century, a genuine affection that blossomed beyond dynastic calculations. Francis Stephen was not born a Greek monarch. He was the Duke of Lorraine, a territory later swapped for Tuscany. He was charming, intelligent, and possessed a natural warmth that balanced Maria Theresa's more serious nature. They had known each other since childhood, and a deep attachment had formed. Maria Theresa genuinely loved him, a rarity in an era where royal marriages were typically alliances of state. They married in 1736, 4 years before her ascension. While Francis Stephen was named Holy Roman Emperor in 1745, he largely allowed Maria Theresa to handle the weighty affairs of state, focusing instead on financial matters, science. He was her devoted husband, the father of their numerous children, and her most trusted confidant. He provided her with emotional stability, warmth, and a private sanctuary from the relentless pressures of her imperial duties. Their marriage was remarkably happy, a true partnership of hearts. Maria Theresa relied on Francis Stephen for emotional support, companionship, and indeed for the sheer joy he brought into her life. He was her anchor, her safe harbor in the tumultuous sea of European politics. They had a large family, 16 children, a testament to their fruitful union. She would often write him letters filled with affection, even when they were apart for short periods. Their life together was a blend of imperial duty and intimate domesticity, an unusual combination for monarchs. Then tragedy struck with devastating suddenness. In August 1765, the imperial family was in Innsbruck for the wedding of their second son, Leopold. Francis Stephen, then 56 years old, was in good health, enjoying the festivity. On August 18th, after a day of celebrations, he was walking with his son Joseph when he suddenly collapsed. He had suffered a massive stroke or heart attack. He died almost instantly in Joseph's arms. The formidable empress who had faced down armies and outmaneuvered cunning diplomats was utterly broken by the loss of her husband, her soulmate. Her grief was profound, immediate, and all-consuming. Contemporary accounts describe her as being inconsolable. She locked herself away for days, refusing to eat or sleep, weeping endlessly. The court was plunged into deep mourning. She blamed herself, believing that her intense focus on politics had somehow hastened his end. The immediate aftermath of his death saw a dramatic transformation in Maria Theresa's appearance and demeanor. From that day forward, she abandoned all color in her wardrobe, dressing perpetually in black mourning clothes. She cut her hair short, refused to wear jewelry, and removed all her elaborate makeup. She had Francis Stephen's apartments preserved exactly as he had left them, a shrine to her lost love. She spent countless hours in prayer, often in the crypt where he was interred. For the remaining 15 years of her life, she performed her duties as empress with the same diligence, but the lightness and joy had gone from her. She became more serious, more introspective, her face etched with a permanent sorrow. The long-term impact of Francis Stephen's death was significant, both personally and politically. Emotionally, Maria Theresa never recovered. Her letters continued to express her deep longing for him, her constant sense of loss. She wrote to her children about her enduring grief, often referring to herself as a poor widow. His absence left a void that no amount of political success or dynastic triumph could fill. Politically, his death meant that her son, Joseph II, was now Holy Roman Emperor and her co-regent in the Habsburg lands. This shift in power dynamics led to increased tension between mother and son. Joseph, impatient and eager for reform, often chafed under his mother's more cautious approach. Maria Theresa, perhaps leaning more heavily on her duties to distract from her personal sorrow, became even more entrenched in her conservative views, resisting some of Joseph's more radical proposals. Her grief may have made her less flexible, less willing to compromise, seeing stability as a last refuge in a world that had taken so much from her. She became increasingly devout, seeking comfort in religion. Maria Theresa's life continued to be one of immense achievement, but it was lived under a permanent shadow. Her enduring grief for Francis Stephen was a testament to the depth of their bond, and a stark reminder that even the most powerful rulers are not immune to the crushing pain of personal loss. She died in 1780, 15 years after her husband, reportedly still mourning him intensely. Her legacy as a brilliant ruler is undisputed, but her personal story reveals a woman whose heart was forever shaped by a love lost too soon, leaving her a grieving widow, empress until her very last breath. Number 7. The Prisoner Prince and a Father's Darkness. Philip II of Spain was one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, ruling a vast empire that stretched across continents, encompassing Spain, its colonies in the Americas, the Netherlands, and parts of Italy. He was known as the Prudent, a serious, devout, and meticulous ruler, driven by a profound sense of duty to God and his kingdom. Yet even in the cold, calculated world of 16th-century power politics, Philip's life was marked by a chilling personal tragedy that continues to fascinate and disturb historians: the mysterious fate of his eldest son and heir, Don Carlos. Don Carlos was born in 1545, the only legitimate son of Philip and his first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal. His birth was difficult, and his mother died shortly after leaving Carlos, without a maternal figure from infancy. From an early age, it became clear that Carlos was not a typical royal prince. He was physically frail, suffering from various ailments, including a severe curvature of the spine. More troubling, however, were his mental and emotional instabilities. He was volatile, prone to violent outbursts, erratic behavior, and moments of apparent madness. Accounts from the time describe him as impulsive, cruel, and fiercely resentful of his father. Some historians speculate that his peculiarities may have stemmed from the intermarriage common among the Habsburgs, or from a head injury he suffered in 1562, which may have exacerbated his existing conditions. As Carlos grew, his relationship with Philip II deteriorated. Philip was a man of order and control, qualities entirely absent in his son. He found Carlos's erratic behavior and open defiance deeply unsettling, not least because Carlos was the designated heir to his immense empire. Carlos resented his father's distant and stern demeanor, his control over his life, and perhaps even Philip's marriage to Elisabeth of Valois, whom Carlos himself had once been intended to marry. He demanded a greater role in governance, particularly in the tumultuous Netherlands. But Philip, understandably, hesitated to grant power to such an unstable individual. The tension between father and son escalated dramatically in the mid-1560s. Carlos, increasingly paranoid and rebellious, began to make rash and dangerous statements. He reportedly expressed sympathy for the Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, a shocking heresy for the devout Philip, and even spoke of fleeing Spain to join them, or worse, of harming his father. He was overheard plotting against Philip, possibly even contemplating his assassination. These were not mere childish outbursts. They were the ravings of a disturbed mind, or perhaps a desperate attempt to assert control in a life where he felt utterly powerless. Philip II, faced with an increasingly unstable and potentially treasonous heir, found himself in an impossible position. He consulted with his closest advisors, with theologians, and even with the Inquisition. His duty to the state, to the stability of his vast Catholic empire, outweighed any paternal affection he might have felt for his deeply troubled son. On January 18, 1568, in a chilling act of regal authority, Philip II ordered the arrest of Don Carlos. The prince was seized in his chambers, stripped of his weapons, and confined to his rooms in the royal palace. His windows barred and guarded. Carlos was held in strict isolation. Philip, ever meticulous, personally oversaw every detail of his son's imprisonment. Carlos's mental and physical health continued to decline rapidly during his confinement. He refused food, then ate excessively, drank vast amounts of iced water, and suffered from various physical ailments. Historians continue to debate the precise circumstances of his death. On July 24, 1568, just 6 months after his arrest, Don Carlos died in his confinement. The official explanation was that he died of natural causes, specifically a sudden illness compounded by his own excesses. However, the secrecy surrounding his death, combined with the extreme circumstances of his imprisonment, immediately fueled dark rumors across Europe. Was he poisoned? Was he driven to death by starvation or the grim conditions of his captivity? Or did he simply succumb to his numerous ailments, exacerbated by his mental state and self-destructive tendencies? Philip II remained stoic and silent, never publicly explaining his decision beyond vague references to his son's disordered conduct. He expressed no public grief. His silence only deepened the mystery and fed the whispers of patricide. For centuries, the black legend of Spain, portraying Philip as a tyrannical and cruel ruler, often highlighted the fate of Don Carlos as proof of his ruthless nature. While modern historians tend to view Philip's actions as a desperate measure to secure the stability of his empire against a genuinely dangerous and unstable heir. The personal tragedy for Philip was immense. He had to choose between his son and his duty, a choice that tore at the heart of the dynasty. The impact of Don Carlos's death on Philip II was subtle but profound. He was deprived of a direct male heir, forcing him to rely on future marriages for the succession. His later marriage to his niece Anna of Austria produced the future Philip III. But the loss of Carlos, however necessary Philip might have felt it to be, solidified his reputation as a cold and unyielding monarch, a man who would sacrifice even his own son for the good of the state and the Catholic faith. It further isolated him, deepening his solitary nature and his unwavering commitment to his imperial mission. The story of the prisoner prince and his dark end remains one of the most haunting personal tragedies in the history of the Habsburgs, a testament to the chilling choices even the most powerful rulers sometimes had to make. Number 8. The Emperor's Exhausting Burden. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, and ruler of a vast empire that spanned the globe, was arguably the most powerful monarch of his age. Born in 1500, he inherited a sprawling collection of territories that included the Spanish kingdoms, the Netherlands, Burgundy, the Habsburg, hereditary lands, and immense new territories in the Americas. His reign from 1519 to 1556 was marked by constant warfare, religious upheaval, and the relentless administration of an empire on which the sun never set. Yet, beneath the veneer of imperial might and steely determination lay a man perpetually burdened, weary, and ultimately shaped by the immense crushing weight of his responsibilities. His greatest tragedy was not a singular event, but the relentless, exhaustive struggle to govern his impossible inheritance, a burden that chipped away at his spirit until he could no longer bear it. Charles's early life was marked by loss and instability. His mother, Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad, was increasingly deemed mentally unstable and was effectively confined for much of her life. Charles was largely raised by his aunt Margaret of Austria, and later his grandfather, Emperor Maximilian I. He never knew a stable family life, and the shadow of his mother's condition, which some historians believe he inherited in part through his melancholic temperament, always loomed over him. The very foundation of his claim to the Spanish throne rested on his mother's incapacity, a complex and perhaps emotionally taxing reality. Upon his succession, Charles was thrust into a world of endless challenges. He faced the rise of Protestantism with Martin Luther, the relentless expansion of the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent, and constant rivalry with France for dominance in Europe. He spent his entire adult life traveling across his vast domains, fighting wars, negotiating treaties, and attempting to impose order on a continent in turmoil. From the battlefields of Germany to the palaces of Spain, from the windswept coasts of the Netherlands to the sun-baked plains of Italy, Charles was constantly on the move, leading his armies, attending diets, and trying to hold his disparate territory together. This perpetual movement and conflict took a brutal toll on his physical and mental health. He suffered from severe gout, which crippled him and caused him immense pain, forcing him to be carried in a litter. He also suffered from chronic indigestion and other ailments, likely exacerbated by stress and a poor diet. But more than physical pain, it was the sheer mental and emotional exhaustion that defined his imperial experience. He was a man of deep faith, but even his piety was tested by the religious divisions that tore at his empire. He craved stability and universal peace, yet his reign was an unending cycle of war and rebellion. Charles's personal relationships often suffered under the weight of his duties. His marriage to Isabella of Portugal was a rare source of personal comfort and love. They were devoted to each other, and her death in 1539, after only 13 years of marriage, was a profound blow. Charles was deeply affected, retreating into solitude and refusing to marry again for many years, a testament to his genuine affection for her. He wore black for the rest of his life as a sign of mourning. This loss deepened his already serious and reserved nature, making him even more stoic and withdrawn. The burden of empire grew heavier with each passing year. He oversaw the conquest of vast territories in the Americas, accumulating immense wealth, but also facing the moral dilemmas of colonization and the relentless logistical challenges of governing a global realm. The pressure to maintain his authority, to finance endless wars, and to secure the future of his dynasty was immense. He rarely had true peace, often feeling isolated at the pinnacle of power, surrounded by advisors, but ultimately alone in his decisions. He corresponded with his siblings, particularly his younger brother Ferdinand, but the weight of his singular responsibility was always his to bear. By the early 1550s, Charles V was a broken man, physically ravaged and emotionally spent. The strain of constant travel, chronic illness, and the relentless pressures of governing a sprawling, rebellious empire had become unbearable. He had fought wars for decades, struggled against the Reformation, and tried to manage a family of squabbling, often rebellious relatives. He had failed to fully reconcile the religious divisions in his empire, and the dream of a united Christendom under his rule remained elusive. He felt that God had abandoned him, and he was ready to lay down his burdens. In a move that shocked Europe, Charles V began a series of abdications in 1555. He first ceded control of the Netherlands to his son, Philip, then the Spanish crowns and the overseas empire, and finally in 1556, the Holy Roman Empire to his brother, Ferdinand. This was an unprecedented act, a powerful monarch willingly surrendering his immense power. It was a profound statement of personal exhaustion and disillusionment. Having divested himself of his crowns, Charles retired to the monastery of Yuste. In western Spain, he spent his final 2 years living a monastic life, focusing on prayer, quiet contemplation, and tending to his clocks and mechanical devices. Even in retirement, however, he was not entirely free. He continued to receive state dispatches, his mind still engaged with the affairs of the world he had left behind. He died in September 1558, still physically and emotionally worn out by the relentless pursuit of imperial duty. The tragedy of Charles V was the crushing weight of his destiny. He was a man born to power, who dedicated his entire life to it, only to find himself utterly consumed and exhausted by its demands. His abdication was a testament not only to his pragmatism, but also to his profound personal weariness. He was shaped by the impossible task he inherited, forced into a life of perpetual struggle that left him with little joy and ultimately led him to choose solitude and a quiet end over the glittering but burdensome throne. His reign served as a powerful example of the personal cost of absolute power. Number 9. The princess imprisoned by grief. Joanna of Castile, known to history as Joanna the Mad or Joanna la Loca, in Spanish, was a tragic figure whose life was shaped by a profound and overwhelming grief that led to her eventual confinement. Born in 1479, she was the daughter of the formidable Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, who united Spain. Joanna was intelligent, well-educated, and fiercely independent, but her emotional vulnerability and intense personality would prove to be her undoing, particularly when confronted with the crushing pain of loss. Her story begins with a love match, a rarity in royal alliances of the time. In 1496, Joanna was married to Philip the Handsome, Archduke of Austria, and heir to the vast Habsburg domains. Philip was strikingly handsome, Maidoc, and shared Joanna's passion for music and the arts. Joanna fell deeply in love with him, a passionate and all-consuming devotion that bordered on obsession. She was fiercely jealous, prone to dramatic scenes. If she suspected him of infidelity, which he frequently committed, despite his wandering eye, Philip was genuinely fond of Joanna, and they had 6 children together, including the future Emperor Charles V. Their early years were marked by a passionate, albeit turbulent relationship. However, the line of succession to the Spanish thrones was volatile. Joanna was originally third in line behind her elder brother and sister, but through a cruel twist of fate, both her elder siblings died young, as did her sister's only child. Suddenly, by 1500, Joanna found herself the direct heir to the unified crowns of Castile and Aragon, a position of immense power and responsibility. This elevated her status, but also introduced new political complexities, particularly concerning her husband, Philip. Philip, ambitious and eager to rule, began to assert his claim to the Spanish throne in his wife's right, often sidelining Joanna. This political maneuvering further strained their already tumultuous relationship. The defining tragedy of Joanna's life, the event that truly plunged her into an abyss of despair, was the sudden death of her beloved husband, Philip, in September 1506. While traveling in Spain, Philip fell ill, possibly from typhoid fever or a strenuous game of pall mall. He died just a few days later, on September 25th, Joanna of 28. Joanna was utterly shattered. Her grief was immediate and overwhelming, going far beyond conventional royal mourning. She refused to be separated from Philip's body, insisting on accompanying his coffin on a slow, protracted journey across Castile, stopping frequently to open the casket and gaze upon his decaying remains. She would sleep in rooms near the coffin, reportedly speaking to him as if he were still alive. She was heavily pregnant at the time, later giving birth to her last daughter, Catherine, during this macabre procession. This public display of extreme prolonged grief, coupled with her already emotional and volatile temperament, led many to believe she had lost her mind. While historians debate the extent of her actual mental illness, some argue she suffered from melancholia or depression. Exacerbated by trauma and political manipulation, her actions certainly appeared to confirm the popular belief. Exacerbated mad, her father Ferdinand seized upon her, perceived incapacity to remove her from power, and effectively usurp her authority over Castile. The immediate aftermath of Philip's death and Joanna's subsequent behavior was her effective imprisonment. In 1509, her father Ferdinand had her confined to a windowless room in the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. She was denied visitors, and her children were taken from her, raised largely without her presence. Her confinement was ostensibly for her own protection and the stability of the kingdom, but it was primarily a political maneuver to keep her from asserting her rightful claim to the throne and to prevent any potential challenge to Ferdinand's regency. Joanna spent the next 46 years of her life in Tordesillas, a political prisoner in her own country. Her life became a solitary existence, marked by long periods of withdrawal, moments of lucidity, and periods of agitation. She often refused to bathe, change clothes, or interact with her few attendants. Her only real contact with the outside world was through her daughter Isabella, and later her son Charles V, who visited her occasionally. Charles, who became emperor in 1519, maintained her confinement, though he ensured she was treated with respect and provided for, even if her condition prevented her from fully appreciating it. The long-term impact of Philip's death and Joanna's subsequent confinement was immense. For Joanna, it meant a life of profound isolation and sorrow, stripped of her royal power and personal freedom. She never truly recovered from her grief, the ghost of Philip haunting her until her own death in 1555. Still a prisoner at the age of 75, for the Habsburg dynasty, her tragedy was a foundational event. Her madness and confinement cleared the path for her son Charles to inherit the vast Spanish realms alongside the Habsburg territories, creating the immense empire he would rule. However, it also cast a shadow over the family, fueling whispers of mental instability within the royal line. Joanna's story serves as a poignant reminder of how deeply personal tragedy, particularly overwhelming grief, could be weaponized, and how it could shape not only an individual's life, but also the trajectory of entire empires. She was a queen undone by love and loss, forever known as the princess, imprisoned by grief. Number 10. The Knight's Shattered Dream. Maximilian I, Archduke of Austria and Holy Roman Emperor, was a figure often romanticized as the last knight. He was a man of boundless energy, grand ambitions, and a deep love for chivalry and the arts. His reign from the late 15th to the early 16th century marked a crucial transition from medieval to modern Europe, expanding the Habsburg domains through shrewd political alliances and strategic marriages, rather than outright conspies. Yet beneath the veneer of military prowess and diplomatic brilliance lay a personal tragedy that shaped his life and solidified his focus on dynastic expansion. The sudden, devastating death of his beloved first wife, Mary of Burgundy. Their union, forged in 1477, was initially a political masterstroke. Mary was the sole heiress to the vast and wealthy Duchy of Burgundy, a territory coveted by the ambitious king, Louis XI of France. Maximilian, then a young, dashing archduke, was sent to secure her hand and her lands. What began as a strategic alliance quickly blossomed into a genuine love match, a rarity in an era of arranged royal marriages. Maximilian and Mary shared a deep affection, a passion for hunting, and a mutual interest in the arts. They had 2 children, Philip the Handsome and Margaret of Austria, who would become pivotal figures in the Habsburg dynasty's future. Mary was not just a political prize. She was Maximilian's cherished companion, his intellectual equal, and the source of his greatest personal happiness. Their love was widely documented by contemporaries, seen as a true partnership. Their idyllic life, however, was tragically short. Lived in March 1482, while on a falconry hunt with Maximilian, near Bruges, Mary's horse stumbled. She was thrown from the saddle, landing awkwardly. The exact nature of her injuries is debated, but accounts suggest she suffered a severe internal injury, possibly a ruptured spleen or a broken back. Despite the efforts of her physicians, her condition rapidly deteriorated. She suffered immensely, bravely enduring her pain. Maximilian was utterly devastated. He remained by her side, constantly praying for her recovery, but his hopes were cruelly dashed. Mary of Burgundy died on March 27, 1482, at the tragically young age of 25. She died in the arms of her beloved husband, leaving behind 2 young children and a grieving realm. The immediate aftermath of Mary's death was a period of intense grief and profound political crisis. For Maximilian, he was inconsolable, his personal sorrow compounded by the immediate threat to his control over the Burgundian lands. Mary's death meant that the Burgundian territories which she had brought to the Habsburgs were now technically inherited by their young children. This immediately reignited the long-standing conflict with France, which saw an opportunity to seize Burgundy. Maximilian, still reeling from his loss, found himself fighting fiercely to protect his children's inheritance, and, by extension, the Habsburg stake in the Low Countries. He faced rebellions from the Burgundian towns who preferred a female regent, Mary's aunt, over a foreign prince. He was left with 2 young children, Philip, just 4 years old, and Margaret, 2 years old, and a vulnerable empire. The long-term impact of Mary's death on Maximilian was profound and shaped the rest of his reign. Personally, he never truly recovered from the loss of his Burgundian rose. He remarried later to Bianca Maria Sforza, but it was a marriage of political convenience devoid of the affection and companionship he had shared with Mary. He dedicated himself with even greater intensity to securing and expanding the Habsburg dynastic power, perhaps as a way of honoring Mary's legacy and ensuring the future of their children. Politically, Mary's death was a catalyst for Maximilian's strategic focus. His subsequent political maneuvers, particularly his emphasis on securing powerful marriages for his children and grandchildren, directly stemmed from the fragility he experienced after losing Mary and the immediate threat to his Burgundian inheritance. The famed Habsburg motto, "Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, Mary, is often attributed to the success of Maximilian's policies in acquiring territory through marriage. He married his son Philip to Joanna of Castile, setting the stage for the immense Habsburg Spanish Empire. Under their son Charles V, he married his daughter Margaret to the heir of the Spanish throne, though this ended in tragedy to the Duke of Savoy. He tirelessly worked to ensure his grandchildren's strategic marriages as well, particularly the infamous double marriage of his grandchildren Ferdinand and Mary to the Hungarian Jagiellonians, which eventually brought Bohemia and Hungary into the Habsburg fold. Mary's death transformed Maximilian from a young romantic knight into a relentless dynastic politician. His personal sorrow fueled his determination to build an unassailable imperial family, to secure through marriage what he had almost lost through an accident. He became a more calculating and pragmatic ruler, always with an eye on the future of his dynasty. His later years were filled with achievements in administration, military reform, and intellectual pursuits, but the shadow of his first great love, Mary of Burgundy, remained. Her sudden passing shattered his personal world, but inadvertently set the Habsburgs on a path of unprecedented power, forged in the crucible of his enduring grief and strategic ambition. The last knight's dream may have been shattered, but his dynastic legacy, born from sorrow, reshaped the map of Europe.